All right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming out on a Friday night. We now know who did not have a date this evening.
Or yet. Yeah, so early.
Oh, it's
early for
All
dates
right.
for the gay men.
Okay.
I'm just saying.
Well, yes.
Really.
But we've been really wanting to have Assemblymember Lowe come down and have an opportunity to speak with us, and it's great that we have managed to put that together, and thank you for all of you for coming out this evening. This is a public meeting, but it's going to be conducted very, very informally. We will, though, stick with tradition in one sense, and I'd like to ask you all to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And with that, I'll turn it over to Councilmember Coors.
Sure, thank you. So we have an agenda which is out if you haven't received it, and it really was more just to provide some ideas for discussion. The main purpose of this is really to hear from the community, get your ideas for areas where you'd like to see state or local legislation or other action and things we can do. So we want to keep this pretty informal. I'll just touch on a couple things the city has done, and then Assemblymember Lowe will talk about all the stuff the state has done. You've been caucus chair 2 years, and I think there are probably 15, 20 bills at least in those 2 years. So it's pretty remarkable in the climate we may be in on a national level to see all the great work that is happening through the LGBT caucus in Sacramento. And really appreciate all that you do to make sure that gets done and happens. You know, here in Palm Springs, the city has been a leader on LGBT rights for a long time, and I see former Councilmember Fote here, so thank you for being here. And over the last couple years, we've done a number of things to advance the rights for the LGBT community. We've signed on to a number of briefs, including briefs before the United States Supreme Court, to protect LGBT laws against claims of religious freedom and what is truly religious-based discrimination. And we've taken action in a number of other briefs. We've also passed the first and only equal benefits law that is transgender healthcare inclusive of any municipality in the country. And that law is actually modeled on a state law, and California is the only state that has such a law. And basically what it says is, if you want to do business with the government and get taxpayer money, you can't discriminate in benefits against people based on any category, including transgender healthcare. And in California, that's the law. But for government contracts, we get lots of bidders who are not California-based businesses. And we want to make sure that if they're going to get our funds, they're in compliance with those same non-discrimination provisions that every business here in Palm Springs has to. And the state's leadership to make this happen, almost a decade ago, maybe 2010 or so, Senator Mark Leno carried that bill, and Palm Springs passed that. And it's something we're going to look at for other cities to do as well, because it sends a really powerful message, and it helps educate businesses about discrimination. And there are healthcare plans that cover everyone, anywhere in the country. So it's really important we move that forward. So I just want to touch on those two things and really turn it over to the Assembly member.
Good evening. Good to see all of you here. My name is Evan Lowe, and I serve as the chair of the LGBT Legislative Caucus in Sacramento. We have a total of an historic 8 openly LGBT legislators in the state of California. This is the most of any state legislature in the nation, a total of 8, and we are diverse with 4 women, 4 men from all across the state, from the Central Valley to the Bay Area and San Diego. We still could use some help here, so just as an FYI.
We're looking that way.
As I look at purposefully as as we need to ensure the adequate representation in all areas throughout the state. But just by way of background, because this is more informal, why are you here? I know why first of all, thank you to the City Council and the city for your gracious hospitality. This is the first of this kind with a partnership of our LGBT caucus. But why are you here? Anything just for that? What would be helpful? Yes. Yes. Okay, so we'll answer that question later on too about the recognition about the various groups of the LGBT community, whether it be through the apparatus of the state Democratic Party, whether it be through the state legislature or even the League of Cities from the city standpoint. And so do we work together with Equality California, or are we in isolation? What else? Any other reason why you yes? Sure. Sure. So a wide variety of issues that I can hopefully punt to our local city council members on some of those tough ones, but in all seriousness, there is a connection, a relationship between that of what the state is doing. And by the way, the state I know has provided millions of dollars to the city of Palm Springs for transportation infrastructure for local projects that will be dedicated for specific projects to Palm Springs that would not be touched and used for any other areas too. But divestments on the public dollars of the retirement fund, CalPERS or CalSTRS, the largest retirement funds for the state of California and its employees, and that of the judicial courts, and then also some issues of housing too. Any other issues before we get into just some of the things that we've worked on? Yes. We still have a long way to go, and I know that our council members also have much to offer as a response to that too. By way of background, yes, what a caucus is basically to try to come together within the legislature. So in the state legislature in the state of California, there are 120 legislators. Each member of the lower house in the state assembly represents 500,000 people, and each state senator represents approximately 1 million people. And whether or not you are part of the Women's Caucus, women coming together to advance the interest of gender pay equity, or whatever the issues might be, or the Asian Pacific Islander Caucus, whether or not it's the Black Caucus, and of course the LGBT Caucus. We have still a ways to go, as you've pointed out, but it is a historic number of 8 openly LGBT members, and we want to create as much of an inclusive environment for others to also join us too, but the work must still continue. So council members, but also some conversations.
One question just on on that is currently all the caucus members are Democrats, correct? I think
Correct.
there was a brief moment, Roy Ashburn was part of the caucus for a couple of months after he was outed, but that was about it.
Yes.
So historically, it's been Democratic, but we, of course, would love to see most of the caucuses are bipartisan.
Yes.
Right.
This election cycle, so in November, of all the state races, there are still, in the general elections, LGBT candidates. In San Bernardino, in Rancho Cucamonga, there is a Republican in the general election who is openly gay, who is also running for that too.
Great. And just so folks know, Mayor Pro Tem Roberts and Councilmember Holstage are sitting over there instead of here because it is a city meeting, even though it's not a subcommittee, and just for Brown Act purposes, we were advised it was better to set it up that way. But they are here, and as long as we're not deliberating, you know, they can share comments as well. And the city manager and our city clerk are here as well. Turn over to Lisa, especially on League of Cities. And Lisa was just elected last month as vice chair of the LGBT caucus of the League of Cities. So we're really thrilled to have someone from Palm Springs in that statewide role. And her opportunity to work with Evan and the caucus, I think, will be terrific. And it was only 10 years ago after the League initially denied allowing an LGBT caucus, because they said there aren't that many LGBT people in California, that the folks who really worked on it kept on it. And there weren't that many LGBT electeds, there were some. And now it's really grown into a wonderful caucus, and really appreciate Lisa stepping up and taking that on.
And the caucus has done some very nice work with the League of California Cities under the leadership of Larry Berman in Signal Hill. They put out an exhaustive report on transgender individuals in city halls and in the workplace that provides hands-on direction and advice for municipalities up and down the state when an individual is going through transition. And I'm just thrilled that all of that work was done before I became a member of the caucus. And I'm joined by a city council member from Menlo Park, and we now have women in both the presidency and the vice presidency of that caucus. So I think we'll get an awful lot done.
Any other areas of interest or concern so we can appropriately accommodate them? Yes. Thank you very much for that recognition. The separation of powers, but ensuring that we also have a fair shot at that. The federal courts and the Ninth Circuit, as you know, as you may know, was very critical in ensuring, for example, when the state of California made history by passing a ban on conversion therapy for minors 18 and under, it was upheld in the Ninth Circuit Court on 2 occasions. So this is very important for us to make sure that we also recognize, of course, within the separations, there's only so much we can do given the equal branches of government, but what are the opportunities that we have to be mindful and then make sure that we exercise our rights to ensure that we have a fair and equitable process there. Any final thoughts or conversations? Oh, yes. Thank you. You're here because to show unity and trying to not make sure that our rights are being rolled back. Yes. Thank you very much. And I see a number of advocates that are familiar faces that have been tireless in meeting in Sacramento and ensuring that we can deliver for many of those things, budgetary-wise and otherwise. Was there a final hand I think I saw two? Well, thank you very much for taking time to actually come here and be informed and part of the process too. Yes. Hate crimes, okay. And then, yes, final.
And if there's an issue I could add that's not been identified so far, that's the critical importance that as our generation grows older, that we have access to culturally competent health care, and we have access to affirming affordable housing. We are the first generation, out generation, to grow old, and it is incredibly important that we do not have to go back into the closet as we age.
All very critical issues that I'm glad that you brought up, because there are a number of pieces of legislation that we have passed and that we hope to continue to advocate for. With respect to insurance, this is why I think it is so important with respect to the recognition of having an openly LGBT elected official. We have an opportunity to do so with our next insurance commissioner, Ricardo Lara. This insurance commissioner position is a statewide elected position that can have an impact on many of these issues that you've addressed. But of course, we cannot accommodate all of the issues one by one here, so we'll be sure to provide our cards here and connect you with the appropriate resources at the state level so that we can follow up on a more direct basis for that too. But having said that, let me just briefly then go into some of the pieces of legislation. So what is the purpose of a caucus? Its purpose is to come together and advocate for the best interests of the LGBT community. And I'll tell you, over a period of time, the tone has significantly changed in the California state legislature. I have been working in the state legislature for almost 15 years now, and I recall that when I first got started, there were very hostile members of the legislature, Republicans and Democrats alike, who had no fear of putting up their microphone and speaking publicly and admonishing and talking about homosexuality being a sin and highlighting the Bible and bringing it to them, using it as a prop. Fast forward to where we are today, the tone has changed because of the presence and because of your engagement to making sure that you talk about the issues that you've all addressed, that you've taken time out of your days to be there. We have straight legislators, both Republicans and Democrats, who have come to the caucus and have said, please provide us with an opportunity to carry pro-LGBT legislation. And in fact, it's become sort of a problem because everyone's fighting over who can carry what piece of legislation. Having said that, we still have a long way to go, which is why we want to elicit your input, because while in the state of California, we may feel like we've made such significant progress, we can see at the federal level how this has provided an opportunity for those who have been silent to now come up and be very vocal in their opposition. And we are seeing that. Again, you've heard the statistics and the challenges with respect to increase in hate crimes. We see it when we are hosting additional town halls, and we see it with the death threats that are real coming directly to myself, and members of the LGBT caucus. So we want to make sure that we are as an inclusive society as possible. So having said that, just very briefly, and we can provide you with additional handouts on a historic number of 15 pieces of legislation that were signed by this governor, Governor Jerry Brown, with respect to continuing education and reducing the number of HIV/AIDS infection requirements in education. Hate crimes policies, establishing minimum standards for hate crime policies adopted by law enforcement agencies. We also have now what we call post-training. So for police officers, public safety members, LGBT-specific educational training for police officers and dispatch that was signed into law to ensure that we have an inclusive community that is recognized. With respect to aging, we added sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression to the list of factors that would allow elderly individuals to be given priority consideration for programs and services administered through the California Department of Aging. We've also focused on a Homeless Youth Act, which would help provide resources and housing for LGBT youth who work through our Homeless Coordinating Financial Council and oversight. We also have prescription drugs legislation that will protect drug users by limiting the sunset date provisions of such areas. Sexual harassment training programs, similarly, that was also passed. Legislation that was passed on school bullying, which would require the California Department of Education to develop guidelines to prevent instances of bullying and harassment and making online training modules available to school staff. These are just some of the basic things that we have done this year. One of the things that we've seen, or a few of the things that we've seen also that was passed, was our Senior Long-Term Care Bill of Rights. And this was by Senator Scott Wiener. This strengthened protections for LGBT seniors living in long-term care facilities against discrimination by not allowing the refusal of residents' preferred names or pronouns and denying admissions to long-term care facilities, and or transferring a resident within a facility or another facility based on anti-LGBT attitudes of other residents, or evicting or involuntarily discharging a resident from a facility on the basis or perceived basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or HIV status. As you probably have heard, we also passed historic legislation which modernized our laws decriminalizing HIV and the reflection of the understanding of HIV treatment and prevention. So no longer that type of discrimination towards individuals living with HIV and AIDS. Finally, also a key bill to recognize is the Gender Recognition Act. This was passed and put into law, which enables transgender, intersex, and non-binary individuals to obtain state-issued identity documents that accurately reflect their gender identity. And this is making our state the first to do so, to not require individuals to officially identify as male or female. The bill created a third non-binary gender marker on California birth certificates, driver's licenses, identity cards, and gender change court orders to recognize such issues. So all of these things we continue to do. I think a number of, when we have these convenings, younger individuals say, well, we have marriage, we have hospital visitation rights, adoption rights. What else do we need to do? The FDA has made a lifetime deferral to now a 1-year deferral on gay men donating blood. But there's still more that we can do. The state also this year officially was the first state to apologize for anti-LGBT discrimination that was enacted into law. So we codified and officially apologized as a state to the discriminatory practices towards the LGBT community. And by the way, with all of these laws that were passed in the state of California, I can't tell you how many state legislators called us to say, we would like to introduce this piece of legislation in New York, in Texas, in Florida, in Georgia. It has just been a great blueprint for the work that we do ahead. And as Councilmember Middleton adequately knows, as do the fellow council members that are here, with the League of Cities, we have something equivalent called the National Conference of State Legislatures, that is the organization of all state legislators. The LGBT component of that is not as robust as it should be, but they have looked to the LGBT caucus because the state of California has also dedicated 2 full-time staff persons to staff our caucus. One of them is here, that is Alina Hernandez. Thank you very much. She's a professional paid LGBT official. She's a paid professional, paid gay, professional gay, paid for public taxpayer dollars. And so she's oftentimes said, I love my job. I get paid to be gay. But it is true. And let me just say that Alina has been in this capacity for 2 years. And when we were interviewing her, she had no experience in politics whatsoever. 0. Didn't work on a campaign, didn't know what government really was all about. But she similarly was disturbed by what we saw at the federal level and said, it is my obligation to do more. So I want to do this. And she has done so with distinction. And she has awesome hair. So, but she is the person that will be focusing on the work that we do ahead of us. So again, I mention that because people say, California, you have it all good. You have Palm Springs, which, by the way, I think you guys are absolutely fantastic. You are more LGBT than San Francisco is. And I tell people that just by the representation and the advocacy alone. And we were so thrilled that we had such great residents who had the foresight of understanding the strength of our diversity, that we recognized the Palm Springs City Council. And it was not simply just the idea of the California State LGBT Legislative Caucus. It was our own speaker of the state legislature, who is a straight ally, who said, this is effing amazing. We need to recognize them for their values. And of course, your legislative delegation were up in arms and said, we want to recognize them on the state assembly floor. We want to do it. And so we had to follow protocol and do as such too. So again, kudos to the advocacy of the state legislature. The local city council in partnership and the partnership with us.
Yeah. I just want to touch on hate crimes for a minute, because actually I think for your benefit, and I hate to, unprepared, ask Chief Ryan Reyes, our police chief, to come up. But I think some of the policies that he's put in place, the advisory committee, the annual town halls, the trainings of officers, could really be good models for the state. And it is greatly appreciated by the whole council and the city, all you have done and the outreach you've done. So I thought that might be helpful since you're here.
Yes, absolutely. It was interesting to hear your comments in regards to the state legislation passing stuff in regards to post-LGBT training. We actually started a few years ago when I first became chief. I reached out to the center. We partnered with the center in Palm Springs. They did a phenomenal job creating a 2-hour block of instruction to teach it started off with me and my entire management staff, all our new hires, and all our training officers go to this 2-hour block of instructions on all things LBGT and what's current, what's outdated, just to educate ourselves, because clearly it's a significant portion of our community and we need to educate ourselves continually. They created such a model program. I'm glad to hear that Post has accepted some standards where hopefully our center can actually get Post approved and teach agencies throughout the state. We do town hall meetings, and that's kind of one of the reasons I'm here today, to educate myself on what's current and what's coming, and so I can share it with my staff, and just as the chief of police of Palm Springs, make sure we're constantly informed.
Thank you very much, Chief, for that. As you've seen, there is a role for all of us to play with respect to increased education from rank and file and law enforcement. And if we can use Palm Springs as a guide for many agencies throughout the state, I know that we'd very much like to partner with you too. So I know that I've jotted down some of these notes too. And as you can appreciate, there are other communities in which in law enforcement, very paramilitary rank and file, there are opportunities of growth and to learn about the strength of our diversity in communities. And it has been a dialogue, to have those conversations and trying to get them to adopt it as well too. So it's a work in progress, and if we can work with you, we'd love to continue to do so. One of the other components that you mentioned, Councilmember Kors, was with respect to public taxpayer dollars. So here is the notion that if we use public taxpayer dollars should not subsidize discrimination. In other words, if there is a recipient, whether or not it be a community-based organization or a university, we should not subsidize discrimination. So what is left for us to do in the state of California? Well, we still have an issue with respect to Cal Grant funding. So we, as California taxpayer dollars, are using what we refer to Cal Grant funding, financial aid. Financial aid is referred to Cal Grant funding that students in California use to go to any type of higher education institution that they choose to go and choose to see. Some of these Cal Grant fundings are following students to religious institutions, whether or not they be Azusa or Biola or Point Loma. And some of these universities will still discriminate based on sexual orientation, whether or not it be separations on dorms or whether or not it's areas of healthcare. And so we want to continue to explore that opportunity to pass legislation that says that if you are recipients of public taxpayer dollars, you should not discriminate. And this should be in areas of housing, areas of education, areas of healthcare, whatever else might be. So that partnership, working with you, Councilmember, I'd love to follow up with you on best understanding some best practices and how we can amplify that statewide.
Well, I'm going to jump in on one thing. When you were going through the list of bills that were passed, I know many of our friends in other states love to talk about, the crazy things that they're doing in California, such as attracting venture capital from all over the world, creating the most robust entertainment industry that you can possibly imagine, taking and moving from a $17 billion deficit to a surplus, balancing a budget here in Palm Springs, growing a downtown, creating some of the nicest hotels that you can find anywhere in the country. Evidently, being crazy is pretty good for business.
See the ad now.
Yes. No wonder why you got elected. I'm so glad I don't represent this area. It's a tough act to follow for all of you, all these high overachievers, I tell you. But having said that, thank you for that recognition. While I love being here, the community that I represent is Silicon Valley. More venture capital than any other region in the United States. We are the 5th largest economy in the world if the state of California was its own country. We have a multi-billion-dollar reserve, a rainy day fund in the state. But there are also significant challenges that also exist and come with that. And while this is a town hall with respect to LGBT issues, a number of the challenges that we have transcend all communities. So is it a problem that, for example, when I served as mayor for a city in the city of Campbell, bordering San Jose, or as a state legislator now, I cannot afford, currently, as a state legislator and a former mayor, I cannot afford to live in the community that I represent. And just say that again, as former mayor, the mayor can't live in their own community. Well, that's not that hard when one needs to earn $270,000. The median income required in my community is $271,000 to afford a single-family home in my community. But don't feel sorry for the politician. What about the future generations? And what about the teachers? I mean, think about this. We're setting up our society for failure, in which we talk about this social contract. What is the role and obligation of our community and our state? We have something called the California Higher Education Master Plan. This is like the guiding document for the state of California with respect to education. And this was implemented in 1960. And that master plan said that we should offer high quality education. And by the way, that education should essentially be free. We should lower the barriers to entry. Why? Because we know that there's a distinction between that of an expense and an investment. Higher education should not be an expense. It is an investment. So we, as Californians should invest in education so that individuals can get the skill sets to become productive members of society and be good taxpayers just like everybody else, and investing in the community, job creators, all the above. And in fact, we've gone so far away from that. Now, we've tried to make some changes. We have community college, free. That's right. In the state of California, community college is free. Why? Because we prioritize, and we just passed that 2 years ago. We believed that we should lower the barriers to entry because this is the great equalizer of social mobility. And yet, in my community, and similarly statewide in the California state system of CSU, it now takes 5 years to graduate. At San Jose State, in my community, only 9% of students graduate within 4 years, only 9%. Similarly, in the UC and the community college system. And then that is exacerbated by the cost of housing. So what are we doing about housing? Well, that's why we passed legislation, and this is a real issue. And I think that's important to talk about because there's a natural conflict, natural give and take with respect to state and local. In other words, the cities will say we want to maintain local control. And the state will say, well, we're looking at things from a wider lens and we want to see more engagement in certain areas. And so this is the reality that exists. Cities and the state oftentimes come in conflict with respect to housing and what should happen and what should not happen. In my region of Silicon Valley, San Jose is the big fish. They take a great share of housing. And so they're building, building, building. But in the smaller cities, there might be a difference in the community feel. And so they might not be taking and building as much housing and more greater density. So we have passed additional pieces of legislation to come up with a framework to allow for expedited processing of housing units to be built. Now, at the same time, therein comes conflict because we don't want to force communities to do what is not consistent with their general plan and take away local control. And yet we also know that there's a housing crisis at hand. So it's a continual conflict and balance and advocacy to best understand regionalism, that what happens in the Bay Area may not happen here in the valley and in the desert, and not the same thing in Los Angeles and in San Diego. But that's why your engagement is helpful, and that's why your council members continually come up to Sacramento and talking about what is best for this community here. But that is something that we grapple with, and we will continue to grapple with on the issue of housing. With the issue of transportation, you will, as a point of fact, this is just fact, the state of California has not passed an increase in revenue streams in over 20 years. That is to say that we think about something differently. And this is the portion of public participation. So let me ask you a very simple question on ice cream. What is your preference of ice cream? For audience participation only, vanilla or chocolate? So by show of hands, how many of you prefer vanilla ice cream? Raise your hand. Okay, take a look at the room. And how many of you prefer chocolate? Raise your hand. Okay, look at that, look at the room. So what was the percentage breakdown of a very simplistic question? Chocolate or vanilla? What was the breakdown? Okay, you must be vanilla. You must be vanilla. Okay. Okay, so roughly the breakdown is 55%, 60%. Okay, let's just say for
I want to recount.
Okay, you want to? Thank you. Okay, I just want to illustrate a very simple thing on governance, and this will make sense in a short while. You had a council member who wanted a recount. Some of you didn't raise your hands, I saw. So what if you didn't raise your hands? What if you thought the process was flawed and you wanted to recount? What if you're like me? You're lactose intolerant. You can't have ice cream. Or what if you said, you know, I want spumoni or strawberry. I don't want those choices. Okay, very simplistic. Now, why did I ask this question? We had this issue of a gas tax. We have crumbling roads, crumbling infrastructure, and we need to fund our infrastructure because the great misnomer is we have not come out of the recession, and we have a distinction between capital and operating budget. In the state of California, capital and operating. Operating is day-to-day, capital is infrastructure. Well, during the Great Recession, We only did and focused on the corrections in the operating. We didn't even touch the capital because we kicked the can down the road, and it was not politically expedient to cost of jobs with the operating. So we didn't do anything on the capital. So we said this past year, we need to focus on transportation funding. So what's a good solution? And this goes to audience participation again. So very simplistic. We need more funding for transportation. A couple of reasons. More fuel-efficient vehicles. Therefore, how do we fund our roads? By the gas tax. So when you go up in the pump at the pump, that's where you pay. But if you have more fuel-efficient vehicles over the past decade, you're going to get more mileage, therefore need less gas. So dwindling revenues for the gas tax. You have hybrid vehicles, dwindling revenues, and you have all-electric vehicles, no revenues. So over the past decade, we've seen significant decline and yet increase in demand. Significant decline. So what do we do? 3 options, audience. 1, increase the gas tax. That's simple, you just increase the gas tax. But we already just made the observation that it's going to be significantly dwindling because we're still going to have more electric vehicles and we're going to have better mileage. And some would argue that's regressive. What about a flat fee? All of us pay $200 a year at the DMV, irrespective of ability to pay. So those who make $40,000 pays $200, or those who make multi-million dollars pays $200. Is that fair? Or the third option, that you pay for the miles traveled. Because you are the user, you should be paying as you go. So however many miles you travel, you should pay. So which options of these 3 options should we choose? So audience, what'd you say? Vanilla. Vanilla. I love this community group here.
Welcome to Palm Springs.
Welcome to Palm Springs. You guys are so great. Okay, option number 1. How many of you support option number 1, which is the increase the gas tax? Raise your hand. Okay, you can see this room. How many of you support flat fee, flat rate? Everyone pays the same amount. Okay, and how many of you support the third option, which is miles traveled? Which, by the way, miles traveled, let's say you're living in my community and you're a teacher. Well, by no fault of your own, you're going to live outside of Silicon Valley. And so you may be living in Stockton, which is an hour and a half away. By no fault of your own, so are we disproportionately hurting those by no fault of their own because they can't afford to pay? Just cost of living? So there's that conflict. So what percentage got the most, and what percentage of the breakdown of the room would you say that was? So I saw more hands for miles traveled. So maybe 30%? 40%? Maybe? Okay. So in the legislature, we need 2/3. So to pass a tax, a revenue increase, you need 2/3. And remember, there are some individuals, some politicians who are ideological, who actually sign pledges that they will never raise a tax. They will never vote to raise a tax. So they're not even part of this conversation. They won't even say, none of the options. I don't support any of them. In fact, I say we should decrease it. So why do I mention that? Because we worked so hard to increase the gas tax, and we had bipartisan support. We actually were able to get 2/3 to put that on, to pass that in the legislature. As a result, a Democratic senator was recalled for his vote, and that Senator Josh Newman from Orange County. And not only that, the Republican Party, as a point of fact, is put this on the ballot for you to vote in November. It's called Proposition 6 to repeal this increase in funding. Now, again, as I mentioned to you earlier, the city of Palm Springs is specifically getting dedicated funding for your roads and transportations that cannot be touched for anything other than your local measures. So this would certainly hurt you in the long run, and I hope to share that observation because, look, government and politics is not easy, but just as something as simplistic as ice cream, we couldn't get 2/3 on vanilla or chocolate. So imagine in government trying to get 2/3 on something as complicated as revenues for our infrastructure. No one likes to raise a tax, but we also have to be intellectually honest, transparent, and accountable to how do we fund our roads, how do we operate, and also making the necessary corrections where possible. So those are some of the things that I think are important for us to think about as it relates to the issues that impact us on a day-to-day basis that will also have an impact on the LGBT community as well.
Just for us here in Palm Springs, that's worth $13 million over the next 10 years. And we had, going into this, been spending approximately $3 million a year. That's how important it is to us.
So I hope you'll consider that when looking at whether or not to repeal Proposition 6. Yes. Yes. Yes, the question was with respect to equity in our tax structure, and is it seen as regressive or not? At the same time, on gas tax and transportation funding, the state of California has put in policies in place to incentivize purchases of electric vehicles and hybrids. And again, these are public taxpayer dollars when you get your rebates so that we can invest and focus on that direction to lower our carbon footprint. That is an area that we want to look at. I will tell you very candidly that we did, again, to try to get, how do you get Republican and other Democratic support in more conservative areas on a tax in general? And so what can we do to try and figure that out? So to answer your question, that was on the table, but imagine having 120 legislators representing different areas to say, what solutions should we try to have? So this was sort of the sausage making in there. I will say though, with respect to revenues, the state of California used to be a manufacturing state, which is no longer the case. We're now majority goods and services. You can appreciate this given the app economy and the different challenges that exist with automation and the future of work. So we no longer are getting a majority of our revenues from manufacturing, and losing on goods and services. There is a proposal in the legislature that did not go anywhere this past year, but I know will be brought up again. But it's a proposal to lower the sales tax, but to start to cross goods and services all across the board. So again, lowering the sales tax, but start taxing goods and services. So if you go to the dry cleaner, if you go to an attorney, if you go to your accountant, to have a more certainty in the revenue stream. As you can imagine, there are pros and cons with both, but what we are trying to look at is to do the right thing, which is when the next recession hits, what do we do for greater certainty? Because the state of California relies so much on capital gains and income tax. These are one-times and so reliant on how the economy is doing. And because we have ongoing expenses, and we heard earlier about CalPERS not entirely being funded. By the way, this is the retirement system for public employees. This is an area that we need to focus on. So we will be taking a look at some of these hard areas on significant reforms on the tax structure, while also focusing on the equity that should be there. And then also other states that are doing an oil severance tax, for example, that we are one of 3 states that doesn't tax with respect to getting oil. So oil severance is perhaps something that we're also looking at. Might there be any other questions or comments from council members or any?
I'll just add, because there was a question on CalPERS and their investment policies. And I don't know if you know that off the top of your head, and I was trying to look it up. But in 2013, there was something in a policy when I was working at the National Center for Lesbian Rights, and I was working with Senator Mark Leno and the LGBT caucus to get CalPERS to divest from a number of Russian internet-related companies that were hosting and publishing the videos of young gay teenagers being kidnapped and viciously attacked. And they did divest under those policies. So we can see if, unless you know them, but there are some policies. I don't think it's a general, you can't invest in any company. I don't think there's a long list of those, but something at that level was sufficient to get them to divest. So, but I can look that up and get back to you on exactly what the policies are.
And I think, yeah, part of that is the partnership on the relationship between the various governmental entities. Could city councils pass resolutions urging CalPERS to divest? CalPERS has already divested significantly in firearms, in fossil fuels, in tobacco. So how do you support many of these different policies with the purchasing power given the magnitude of the state of California?
Yeah, and definitely worth looking into what the policy is and what maybe can be done at the state level on that. The only other thing on CalPERS that I do want to share as we have you up here is obviously every municipality in the state has a huge problem coming because CalPERS expected rates of return are not what they calculated. And so, you know, we're going to go from a position where 10 to 12% of our annual budget is going to CalPERS, and for the exact same pension, for the same number of employees, it's going to go up to 27 million, which is about 25% of our budget. 2 years ago, the city council started putting $6 million away a year, which is a chunk of money that we would rather spend on other things. But so we're prepared, because if we wait 5 years when we know it's coming, we'd have to cut 25% from our budget, which would be incredibly painful. So we are taking that kind of action, but ultimately, this is going to have to get fixed at the state level, because you are going to start having municipalities and others face bankruptcy. And so I don't know if there's any sort of new plans on the horizon or some great brilliant ideas you might have. But
this is, again, on stability and funding on the retirement system of both CalPERS and CalSTRS for teachers. We have an incoming governor who has indicated an interest in making sure that we have...
There is an election coming up, by the way.
Yes, I know.
So please vote, but but enthusiastic is good.
Yes,
optimistic.
yes. So...
Yeah.
Yes. Well said. But again, it goes back to this notion about the challenge that we have just in government in general. What is politically expedient, and then what is good public policy, and what do you, like a Venn diagram, and where do you find the middle ground? And it's not easy, because these are not sexy issues. And so when you have revenues that come into the state, where do you put them? Do you put them to capital or operating? And who do you hear from most? Well, it's the people on the operating side. It's not the sexy stuff on the capital, but it is something that is a time bomb. And we have taken a number of steps, as you probably know, for those of you who are in city business. There are multiple tiers now of benefits, multiple tiers of individuals. So if you were a public, if you worked for a city 15 years ago, there was a different defined benefit plan than if you start now. But with that recognition that people are living longer, and it's the same thing that is exacerbated at the federal level with Social Security and other issues. But nonetheless, this is something that we will continually try to tackle.
Thank you, Evan. Bringing it back to LGBT issues specifically, people are very frightened, and I think rightfully so, about the new balance on the Supreme Court, or I should say the lack of balance on the Supreme Court. What do you see as primary issues there where we are threatened, where existing legislation is threatened, and how can everyday people like us, not only we as a city and a city council, but as a community, start pushing back on that now if you think there are specific issues that we're going to be faced with immediately?
It is a sad reality. I feel like my obligation of the caucus is so to be chief just the cheerleader for our community. And given the separations, it is daunting. But we have seen some significant rollbacks with respect to the Supreme Court on pregnancy centers, for example, on abortions, and whether or not you can be allowed to talk about whether or not you should get an abortion or not. And I know that this is not just a Planned Parenthood issue, but this also goes into that, a speech on conversion therapy, for example. So could there be a possibility that this issue of conversion therapy that now has been passed in 15 other states will be overturned and eliminated? That is a real threat and a real possibility. What do I mean by that? Again, 15 states have passed that ban on conversion therapy for minors in 18 and under, but given the Supreme Court, if it does get back to the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, this could be seen as protected speech, as it was also done so with respect to pregnancy centers. So thereby the fear of invalidating all of the protections for banning conversion therapy for minors 18 and under in all 15 states. That is a real issue. You've still seen the wedding cake issue, to which an individual given religious protections. So could we be on the defense in seeing legislation coming towards us and stating that because of religious exemptions and protections that, yes, and even in our home state of California, universities could discriminate based on sexual orientation, irrespective of whether or not you get public taxpayer dollars or not. This is real. And what we attempt to do, again, given what we have the authority to do, given states' rights, that's why I'm proud of our Attorney General. He is our chief law enforcement officer, and he has litigated and fought for us in the state of California against the Trump administration on many of these different areas. But we've seen a number of court rulings over the past year that have not gone in our favor and have gone the other way. So what can we do as part of the question and part of organizing action is to make sure that we have public officials who understand the importance of basic equality under the law. And there are neighboring communities here that I think to which we can ensure that public officials similarly are held to account. And so if you know of their district offices, show up en masse to demand for these basic protections and asking them to publicly pen op-eds to change the hearts and minds of people. Because having said that, these are individuals that can change policies of respective other parties. And so if you're part of the Republican Party platform, could you help change the hearts and minds there too? As I mentioned earlier, we had bipartisan support on banning of conversion therapy or qualifying conversion therapy as a fraudulent practice earlier this year. And because we had 2 Republicans join in support of that, it frankly shamed the local Republican legislator here and saying, you had complete cover, why didn't you vote similarly? And putting on that pressure. But it is not easy, given the capacities that they're in. But we can try to make sure that they're respecting their communities equally. But I don't have all the answers. You equally, by the way, would have great answers as well,
and I
too.
do think, it's a great question. And I think the biggest threat, which is very hard for us to fight at a local or state level, is we've seen license to discriminate laws passed in a number of states, and the state banned travel to North Carolina, the city banned travel to North Carolina. We can use some economic impact. But a case will get to the United States Supreme Court that will make the argument that if you have a religious belief that against LGBT people, you can discriminate them in any private business, in any government, in any way possible. And that's really the only way that can be fought is through who's on the Supreme Court, because that would, pardon the expression, trump any congressional or city or state law, because they would say that's religious freedom, that it's not just freedom to worship, it's freedom to practice your values even if it takes away other people's rights. And that's really scary. And that's something we don't know how this court would rule, but where it's moving is a real concern. And it's something we all have to just be conscious of. And part of it is just be public education about the harms that would do. When we look at the cake case, They didn't get to the merits of the case. They didn't say it was okay not to bake the cake. They said the way the Colorado Human Rights Commission handled it was wrong, showed bias before they made their decision. So they sort of punted on how they might rule on that. But with the shift in the court with Kavanaugh, we're in worse shape than we were 2 weeks ago. And so it's really going to be public education and educating people about why it's wrong, because it wouldn't just be LGBT people, right? Religion's been used to discriminate against people based on race and based on gender. I mean, it would just be basically eviscerate all of our non-discrimination laws. And I think the public outcry, if there's the public education, would be enormous on that because of the breadth of it. And I don't think that's happened yet. And that's something we all can help do, right? Whether it's letters to the editor, it's engaging on social media in those kind of ways. But that's going to need to happen at whatever level it can.
And I think it's incredibly important that we recognize that that ability to discriminate based on some crazy interpretation of religious liberty could apply to anyone. Why should I, as a Christian, have to provide services to the Muslim? Why, as a non-believer, should have to provide services to the Christian, and so forth and so on? This is the 21st century version of separate but equal.
And you said adequately. I talked about non-discrimination, historic non-discrimination policies put into place on retirement communities for the elderly. But those could be similarly rolled back with the United States Supreme Court. And an organizing action. Again, I know this is a public event, but I'll say it. Your state legislative delegation could be stronger. And you have an opportunity continually to hold him accountable to ensuring that these things, he stands up to his own party and talks about what is so important and why this is so dangerous to his constituents, to his communities, to the people he works for. We have an annual meeting with the governor to discuss the LGBT caucus legislative priorities. Part of those legislative priorities, and they're not just pieces of legislation, but they also include appointments. Members of the LGBT community should be appointed to the UC Board of Regents, to CSU trustees, to community colleges, to the Air Resources Board, and that of the bench. We still have yet to have an openly LGBT member on the state Supreme Court, but we are working and we have a short list that we have provided the governor's office, but we do that, but we can always do more. Having said that, also understanding the distinction between that of California Superior Court judges, the Ninth Circuit Court, and then that of at the federal level. So, but we can make significant change by getting our congressional delegations to reflect the values that I think many of us care about too.
Thank you. I have a question about your plans for your conversion therapy bill going forward. So Councilmember Middleton and I had the fortunate experience of being honored in Sacramento and meeting with your caucus. Thank you for that. And we had the unfortunate experience of getting off the elevator and walking through a hallway of hundreds of people with children, protesting conversion therapy bans, people wearing changed t-shirts saying that they've been changed and converted from gay or lesbian. And so that was a really hard moment for us and for the city of Palm Springs, or for our residents. I know that we want to take a leadership role. So if there are ways that we can help you, we want to know that. I know Councilmember Middleton and I walked away saying, wow, I bet there's a lot of people in our community who have firsthand experience with conversion therapy. I know a number of them myself. So could you talk a little bit about that bill? And, for us, it was very shocking representing the city of Palm Springs and realizing how much more work we have to do just in California, and then ways that we could help you push that legislation or other work forward.
Thank you very much for that. And part of the reason why we're here is because you were in Sacramento and said, what else can we be doing to ensure that the LGBT caucus is listening to the residents here? We said earlier that conversion therapy was passed in 2012, and 15 other states also joined us for minors 18 and under. This year, I, along with the Legislative Caucus, our 8 legislators, introduced a bill to qualify conversion therapy as a fraudulent practice. In the state of California, we have a narrow law with respect to fraudulent practices, referred to as the Consumer Legal Remedies Act. So under the Consumer Legal Remedies Act, there are a number of different financial transactions that would be considered fraud, a fraudulent practice. And the bill simply stated that if an individual was to sell conversion therapy, that is to say that they can change you from being homosexual to heterosexual, that would be considered fraud, because we wanted to make this apply to adults as well. This received bipartisan support, but I'll tell you very personally, it was disheartening to see that when I presented the piece of legislation, those that were in support of the bill to make it a fraudulent practice, the testimony was maybe about 10 minutes. The testimony in opposition was approximately 2 hours. And there were busloads of individuals throughout the state, including San Francisco, including Silicon Valley, all over, being busloads to oppose this legislation because there was fear that this would ban the Bible. And there's this misinformation that was out there. But again, we believe that we would have significant support for that. We will introduce the piece of legislation again in the following year to find out how we can craft the legislation to ensure that we can protect all Californians from such harmful practices. As you know, the California Medical Association, Psychological Association, Marriage and Family Therapists all discredit this as not only harmful, but has no functional utility in doing so. At the same time, we were able to work with those in the enlightened communities of the religious side, which is that there is an op-ed in the Orange County Register from the former president of the National Evangelical Association, who said that conversion therapy not only does not work, but it is a harmful practice and it is anti-Christian. So part of this process is that we're trying to work with the religious community and those that are enlightened to also provide some balance. So opportunities that you can provide is to get your residents and your communities out to send letters specifically to your legislative representative who did not vote in support of this piece of legislation. He did not support this legislation, but to show up in numbers and to demonstrate that let us demonstrate the courage of your convictions and show love. So if we can get additional Republicans supporting that, that would be helpful, but we will continue that again. Yes.
As a follow-up to that, Evan, the entire council was there when this particular group was there at Sacramento trying to fight this. And In fact, the mayor and I found ourselves in Senator, just lost blanked on his name, our senator, Stone, thank you. Wonder why I would lose that. So in his 10 by 10 lobby, it was the mayor and I wearing, I'm sure, some rainbow something or other, with probably 100 people. We could barely move. And so I can top you, Lisa. I literally had somebody this close to my face talking to me about this issue. I couldn't move. So, but the point is, I found it very disturbing that you said there were so few in support who are speaking up on this. And the opposition was using typical tactics, scare tactics, which work so well, like this unravels the Bible or this goes against the Bible, whatever it is they said. And we heard it. I stood outside for a while and listened to the chants. I wanted to fully understand what these people had been told or why they believed the way that they did. And there was clearly a lot of misinformation. Fear was used. What is your plan to counter that? Clearly, we have a problem in this country in general, getting the electorate to come out. For some reason, we're asleep, and Democrats seem to be worse than anyone right now. What is your plan to wake up the electorate on your own issue? How do you really get people focused on this? If they're going to use lies and misinformation or scare tactics, how do you counter that? Because you have to. And I think we have to, at all levels these days, counter that, because that's the tidal wave that we're all getting washed under in. But I want to know from you specifically, and am I putting you on the spot? Yeah, I guess I am, and I apologize for that. But I think it's important. I think that you are standing in front of a very, very important piece of legislation, and I think that every time we lose something now, it's dangerous, because that sends a strong message to the other side that it's okay to pick apart the laws and legislation that we've worked so hard to win. So I'll let you answer the question now.
The truth is, I don't have a perfect answer, and I very much would welcome your insights and anyone's suggestions on that. And I saw a few hands, but just a response to that. What we saw was very clear, and this was my message. Part of it was that I went on a listening tour. I was very uncomfortable, and I went to meet with a number of religious leaders throughout the state, very hostile, oftentimes. But I felt it was important for us to do so that they knew where this was coming from, what the intent was all about. And part of that was that I learned a majority of religious leaders also would publicly denounce conversion therapy. Truly. They said, we would stand with you and denounce conversion therapy, but we feel like this bill is going too far, and or if it's not this bill, then it's going to be something else, that you're going to then ban conversion therapy, and then you're going to prevent other things and not let us do our thing. So it basically goes down to the fundamentals of the culture wars. And what we observed and noticed was that the religious right was so good at rallying their base for very protectionist views, which is to say that this bill will ban the Bible, so they're going to come after us. How dare they come after us? So you must rally and energize. Versus on our side, well, we take it easy. We have marriage. We have all these protections. Conversion therapy, oh, it's already banned. It's not really, if you have not been subjected to it, perhaps it's not as an important issue to you. So just in terms of the raw emotion about what that meant to different communities, you're fundamentally attacking that of a church, and or then on the other side, well, how does this impact you? Whereas it's sort of universal. The message was given out that it was going to be an attack or taking away fundamentally the rights of individuals to gather and worship. So we lost that argument. So, but you are absolutely right. Then how do we recalibrate, come back and to form the narrative appropriately? But I will tell you, as you saw from many of those that were testifying, you had people who called themselves formers. I learned this. This was not a terminology that I'm familiar with. They called themselves formers. And they went up person by person in testimony, said, I'm someone who has been changed. And by the way, here's a picture of my family, and I'm a former homosexual. And in fact, this is a point of public information. The first two people who spoke in opposition to the bill were two victims from the Pulse shooting. You recall in Orlando, there was a nightclub shooting. Two survivors came and testified and said, I am no longer homosexual, and I have been changed. Of course, there were many of us that were flabbergasted and said that we believe that there are a number of people who have suppressed their identities, and or for the two victims at the Pulse, the survivors from Pulse, was that this was such a horrific point in their life, of a situation that they are seeking. And this is where it comes down to conversion therapy. They are seeking out, in moments of vulnerability, individuals who are seeking help, parents who are saying, I'm willing to pay you thousands of dollars to make my child normal, just like everybody else. Finding those moments of vulnerability. And that's exactly what they used. They used an opportunity to have vulnerable individuals saying, we want you to become part of this, and then spew out this hatred. But that goes fundamentally to the core of why we want to get rid of conversion therapy, because it's taking advantage of vulnerable populations who are seeking help in which they need to be loved and celebrated, and we want to empower them with the tools necessary to be who they are. But that is an ongoing conversation that, again, specifically what can be done just here in this backyard, getting your legislator to vote in support of the community that he represents.
I just want to point out that on the other side of that, as Councilwoman Holstead pointed out earlier, I've met a number of people who were, well, damaged is a gentle word, but almost ruined. And then I've heard of cases of suicide, of people who were forced to or chose conversion therapy because of the shame and the discrimination and the ugliness that they got about their homosexuality. It would seem to me that those people would be a very effective group to argue the case that you're making. So if we have people walking in, and I met those people, I stood with literally 3 inches from a man who held up a picture showing me his wife and kids, and then telling me about his great gay life in Palm Springs prior to that, while he was checking me out physically. Mm-hmm. So it would seem to me that you have a very compelling group of people, if you can gather them, that would make a very emotional case for how truly destructive this is. And I just want to suggest that. And I don't know if you see them. We see them here because these kinds of conversations occur here. I remember during our film festival, there was a film about it, and we had a number of people in the audience who spoke, who just happened to be there on this issue. And the whole audience was moved to tears with their stories.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because there is a film coming out referred to as the film's name is Boy Erased, and it stars Nicole Kidman and Russell Crowe. This film will be coming out next month, and the LGBT Caucus would love to partner with the Palm Springs City Council to host a screening here, and also do an invitation with some testimonies of survivors of conversion therapy, and invite your legislative delegation to also join us to listen to their constituents. So I would be delighted should you accept that invitation, an opportunity for me to come down and also
forehead's nodding,
to get your state assembly member and your state senator to also listen to your community and your residents after this screening that we will have.
We didn't violate the Brown Act, so we shook our heads.
Yes, I saw a question in that.
I see Tommy, you had your.
I saw her hand back, far back.
how do we protect individuals? Therein lies the need for the piece of legislation to state exactly what this is. Part of that is, again, where we've seen the direction of the courts going with protected speech, and understanding the necessary authorities and the areas of jurisdiction. So whether or not it be a local jurisdiction or who is the governing authority in your situation, for example, and how do we address and accommodate those accordingly. But so specifically, happy to reach out with you directly and get you that contact information so we can best understand the situations and the mechanics of that and trying to accommodate some of those things. Oh.
Okay, to change direction a little, focusing on ending the epidemic. So the Center for Disease Control came out with a process, and the state of New York as well, to prevent HIV infections by increasing the uptake of PrEP and PEP. We can do that, and we're working to do that here. The LGBT caucus has been fundamental in helping us with that. The issue is really just appropriations. It's coming down to money and being able to get more PrEP counselors out on the streets, and also to minority and underserved populations that do not have the availability of reaching health care as easily as the majority of the population. So my question is, how do we bridge that gap to get through the Appropriations Committee this year, to get more funding, to get more people on the street, to test those communities that are not being tested or who are purposely, willfully neglecting their HIV status or saying because I'm not gay, but will have sex with the person of the same sex. And secondly, we never really touched on any transgender issues also tonight, and anything that's coming up for the next year on transgender health.
Tommy, come on down.
Yeah, I can encapsulate both of them.
So I got a comment and some questions. I'm sorry, I've been sitting back there absorbing everything. I think it's really important when we talk about conversion therapy, we don't forget bi. I heard a lot of straight and gay, and I think it's really important that we find some sort of balance in that. But my questions are more about the trans community. And one of the things that I've noticed that is going on is that in the LGBT community, a lot of people are very politically correct, especially people who run for office and are in positions. But when it comes to the T, even 10 years later, they're still triple, double the statistics on everything. And so my concern is how would you define an ally? And we had a big meeting at the Health and Wellness Center. About 30 people was intensely engaging to find out how an ally is defined. It varies from being politically correct. And then the other question that I have is that I'm finding that there's an intense amount of lack of policy and legislation and health care and things for the transgender community here. We have an estimated 7,500 trans people that are not linked into health care that are living with HIV here. And they're afraid of health care, they're afraid of criminalization and other things. In addition to that, I recently had one that had chest construction, and it was so botched that he went like this and it would squirt blood for 2 feet. And the doctor said that's normal. Another one, and this is a true story, happened this year. She had her vaginoplasty. They left a grapefruit size of gauze up in her vaginoplasty and never took it out. When they took it out, her fresh tissue, everything else came out. So she's going to have revisions. When these things happened, there was no one in the community that could help them. They had to go to LA. So I understand that we're doing a lot of different things, but I'm kind of trying to understand what legislation or policy that we need to do to get people more engaged in this community, which is just heavily underserved. And that's just a really big concern of mine. So should I shut down now?
Oh.
All right.
And again, before Councilwoman responds, that's why we're here. This is exactly why we're gathered here, to best elicit what we should be doing, because we don't have all the answers, and what are the things that we've been doing administratively, budgetary-wise, legislation, to accommodate all of the needs of our diverse communities as well.
So Tommy and Herb Schultz, who previously was the director of the Department of Managed Care, and I did have an opportunity to meet with telephonically with leadership at the Department of Managed Care regarding these incidents. It certainly reinforces the need to have culturally competent care within our health community, but also we need more individuals who are trained and capable of carrying out transgender health care. One of the things that when you attend a healthcare conference on transgender care that so frequently comes up is the patient is educating the physician on the needs that they have and on the standards of care that are appropriate to them. So I'll never forget an incident where one transgender physician brought up her own experiences and then said, try to imagine someone walking into their cardiologist, and the cardiologist turns to the patient and says, well, it seems you have a heart condition. What do you think we should do? That is unfortunately an experience that so many of us have had. I can tell you from a personal experience, I don't think I have spoken at any time in my life with a transgender person who does not have a healthcare incident that went badly. Sometimes they are minor and they are simple things that can be remedied very quickly. In other instances, they have been very dramatic.
And just to add to that just for a second, just to let you know what we're going through down here, I've had 3 trans men that have had top surgery where their nipples have fallen off. To give you an idea of what we're dealing with down here.
And I just want to add, because I think to Tommy's point, and it goes to a lot of this, I think legislatively, California has and will continue to do stuff to get us legal equality, but lived equality for a lot of people in our community here, but especially in other parts of the state, of course, as well, is a very different thing. And to me, that is through budget advocacy, to make sure we're getting the funding, because getting doctors who, we can get them some training on being culturally competent, which is really important, and we can do that through legislation, but actually getting doctors who are trained in transgender healthcare to not just be in the big cities is a challenge. And that's funding, right? That is having the resources to try and attract those doctors. So that's an area we need to focus on. So who are the budget chairs currently in Assembly and Senate?
Councilor Corse goes straight to this is the specifics on effective advocacy, and it's knowing who is there. So the questions with respect to PrEP and PEP. This is sort of a process thing. This year, the LGBT caucus passed a resolution on, which was concurrent resolution 258 on PrEP and PEP Awareness Day in California, which was voted by the legislature, thereby providing an opportunity to build off of that and say, well, because we've passed this as a statement of values, now we want this budgetarily in appropriations the following year. The chair of appropriations in the Senate is a gentleman by the name of Anthony Portantino, and he represents Glendale, Burbank area. Point of fact is that he lost his brother to HIV and AIDS. And so the LGBT community is very near and dear to his heart. And so understanding that, that would be a great opportunity to advocate to him because he'd be very receptive to such issues. Similarly, on transgender issues and things that we've done earlier this year, unfortunately, similarly, this was held in the Appropriations Committee. But this was the Dignity and Opportunity Act. It's referred to as Senate Bill 990. The bill required jail and prison employees to refer to transgender individuals by their preferred gender pronouns and names, and ensures that transgender people placed in solitary confinement for their own protection have access to program services and work opportunities despite being in solitary confinement and being separated from the general population. This also referenced that transgender women in particular are often housed in male prison facilities, and there's stigmatization that is there. So we want to build off of the work that we're doing in certain areas and try to find other opportunities for legislation. So at least hearing the day-to-day things that are important, it would be helpful. And if you have some specifics on what is not working, we will entertain that as we head into the next legislative year for the bill introductions.
I think the biggest thing that's not working is the lack of support. We hear a lot of voices, but when it really comes down to the finances or support or being there, it's not there. And I give that to privilege and entitlement. Everybody wants to be the center of a gala, okay? They love that stuff. But when it really comes down to the day-and-day things that we need to do, it's not fun. And they're not there for us. And so what happens is, I use an example of the LGBT community. Almost everyone donates to a thing that's called LGBT, okay? But the gays and lesbians are predominantly the apex of the LGBT. They live in privilege and entitlement. They're $500,000 homes. They're $100,000 salaries. Where the T still is double, triple, quadruple the statistics. So this trickle down does not really work to help that community. And there needs to be something there that allows them to grow and prosper instead of being a marketed thing. So what happens is you get people who market on disparities, and then they don't really want those to change. So I think it's really important that there's be something that is there that provides for that community across our state, because, I mean, we're double the unemployment. Locally, we're 75% more inclined to commit suicide, where the national rate is 6%. We have 7,500 trans people living with HIV that are afraid to get into healthcare because of abuse or the criminalization of HIV. We're educating them. So I think there's something there that we need to really focus more on that minority. If we're really going to be an LGBT community, we have to support really the underserved. I mean, there's some great people in our community that are very big supporters. Don't get me wrong, it's not all. But it is one of those things that I feel that really needs to have some great focus. And I'm not sure how we can fix that without cultural education and the will of the people to want to change it. Because most people are seeking going up the ladder, and we're just asking for a ladder, you know? And so that's I think is our biggest problem.
So we're making progress. We've got much more progress to go. I see another hand going up.
I had a thought that might work. I don't know about budgetary constraints or anything, but I was thinking maybe mandating a certain number of educated transgender professionals, or not being transgender, but just being educated in transgender care. Social workers, case managers in certain hospitals that have a certain population, or in an area that has a certain population, to mandate some type of person that will advocate for the transgender community in those healthcare facilities. That was my thought.
If I could comment really quickly, it's not a Brown Act issue, so I'm going to, just to respond to Tommy, Planned Parenthood of the Pacific Southwest, which is our local Planned Parenthood, I'm on the board in my other hat, is expanding to transgender healthcare and trying to build that competency. However, the funding from the state, you know, we're doing that with our own funding. The state recently increased Medi-Cal reimbursement rates, which were among the lowest in the country, so thank you for that. But funding and budgetary incentives to actually provide that health care, that's not is what isn't there, and that's what we need. We recently had the tobacco tax, which we got a portion of, which allowed us to provide some services, but I know there are agencies that want to do this work, but we really are in a healthcare desert here, even though healthcare is our #2 industry. It's really hard for a lot of people, and it creates significant health disparities, which is a big issue here and in underserved regions. So thank you for all your work on that.
And I appreciate your recognition of the work that you're doing and the intersectionality and delivering the services for the people that we represent as well. Yes, it comes down to funding and budgetary issues. We will put all of our names on budgetary letters to support all of the things that we've talked about. It is a work in progress. And let me just again comment on the recognition of being very sympathetic to a wide community. You know, you mentioned about the LGBT community and not leaving out the T. Similarly, the Asian Pacific Islander community, that's the same thing. Chinese are very different than Laotians and Thai and Vietnamese, and yet Asians are seen as a wide swath perhaps of a model minority, but when you disaggregate the data, you see there are significant challenges with respective communities as well. So we need to be culturally competent on all of those things that we want to deliver for our community. So we hear you loud and clear, and we'll certainly follow up with you as well. Were there any Are there any final questions or comments that we can?
We can repeat it. Wait.
Up with was 0.6%. I can hear me. What they came up with was 0.6%. California, along with 3 other states, was 0.8%. What that means is here in California, with our 39 million plus population, that's over 310,000 people. In the Inland Empire here, which is about 4.5 million, that's 36,000 people. Here in the Coachella Valley, where we're about 350,000 people, that's about 2,800 people. So my point is that these numbers are not insignificant. A lot of people will tell you that they think the population is small because they've never met any trans people. But the actuality is we're out there and they just haven't noticed them.
I mean, what's that? The mic is right behind you.
I thought I was loud. Oh, hello, video. Just to give you an idea, we opened the Transgender Health and Wellness Center in May, and we have been intensely struggling to stabilize. As of this week, we've had 13,000 people come in and out our doors for volunteering or seeking resources since May. We're an invisible community. Most of us try to blend in, and we do exist, but we need the help of our community to survive.
Let me also just say that we've also partnered with TransCan Work in the state capitol on identifying other additional opportunities and hearing from individuals day in and day out on things that we can be doing in the state capitol legislatively and otherwise.
Yeah, I had asked earlier about housing, and I'll be honest with you, I'm just not satisfied with the answer you gave. I'm 63. At 65, I will lose half of my income because I'm like a number of long-term survivors. We had a private disability policy that we never thought we would live to the end of, but in fact we are. We moved here to Palm Springs, and I used to work for Positive Resource Center in the Bay Area when I could still afford to live up there. And we had many people leave the Bay Area to come down here because of affordability. Same is true with Los Angeles. I came down ultimately from Seattle because I couldn't afford it up there and I couldn't get ADAP assistance. There's an assumption that we can get help through every AIDS service organization, but that isn't necessarily true. It's all dependent on your income. And if you make a little too much money, you're not going to get much in the way of help. And so I'm telling you, as somebody who fought for our rights since the 70s and put up with being shot at and shouted at and all kinds of horrible things, I can't tell you how many times I corrected the spelling of the word faggot in my workplace back in the 80s. I really have to tell you, I want to live with dignity the rest of my life. And it's not satisfactory to me if I hear generalizations about housing. I'm disappointed, and I know I've discussed this with a couple of council members, but I'm disappointed and very concerned that we've been able to invest quite a bit of money in our downtown. But we haven't built a single apartment unit in this town for 10 years, and we don't have affordable housing in the pipeline that I know of, with the exception of what DAP may be doing, and that's not enough. So I challenge you. I mean, we were smart enough to create a community of our own and find our way to equality to some degree. So I challenge you to do the same thing with regard to making sure we have housing and health care. We may have to do it on a local level and a state level because we can't rely on the federal government as long as you know who is in charge. But I ask you to do that.
You had indicated unsatisfactory answer with respect to housing. We've passed 15 pieces of legislation that I can share with you from the state level on what we've done, including increasing revenues on transaction fees from those in the real estate community to go to a housing fund for cities to access for affordable housing. We've passed a Housing Bond Act. We've expedited many of the different pieces of law to help facilitate additional developments in other areas. We focus on other areas of housing, including grounding units or dwelling units so that you can have additions to your homes, and very prescriptive on making sure that cities appropriately approve many of these different developments. Again, there comes in lies the conflict between other cities and also the state as well. But we continue to try to do more, but it's a massive, massive undertaking. But we try to pass pieces of legislation on the periphery to accommodate these different things. Again, it comes down to local control and making sure that it is consistent with the local communities and what makes sense for them. That's where lies the problem. So coming to the council chambers, I think, is an appropriate fashion. But again, when you talk about the state level and what we're trying to do, we've tried to increase funding because we've also hurt cities. Again, during the downturn in the economy, we did something called the elimination of the redevelopment agencies, which was the tools and the mechanisms to allow for cities to develop in dilapidated areas. But we eliminated that because of the downturn in the economy. So that's why we try to reinvest and give cities additional tools, but it's not enough. But it's a partnership that must happen.
We certainly know, and we've spoken, and we're going to speak again. We have to be building more affordable housing, not only here in Palm Springs, but across the state. And it is simply a myth that everyone in the LGBT community is living a prosperous life. That is simply not true. And I'm thrilled for all of those who are doing extremely well, but there are a number of people in our community in every one of the letters L, G, B, and T who are struggling economically.
And without getting into deliberations, because we have two folks here on the Affordable Housing Subcommittee and more than two folks here, but the council did take a position on Proposition 1, which is on the November ballot, which is a $4 billion bond measure for veterans and affordable housing. There are over 135,000 homeless individuals in California. We have a true housing crisis. And just for the assembly member, since you don't represent our district, but in many ways you represent us in your other roles, this city has not been very supportive of some of the League of California Cities positions that would leave it all up to local control, because every single city in this state has to do their equal and fair share of affordable housing. And so when you need cities to come forward to say, no, actually, we're okay with giving up local control, if everyone's treated the same, please reach out, and then we will bring that up to the dais, and assuming the council is in support, we can be called on to come and make those lobbying efforts, because we're want to do our fair share. And the problem is, as you know, there's a lot of opposition where cities want to have full control over this. But if everyone doesn't build housing, everyone's going to make the same argument. Let someone else do it. So it really has to fall equally on everyone's plate. And losing federal tax credits has been a big problem. And so whatever the state can do, and I appreciate the bond measure, which I think if it passes is going to really provide some opportunities to get the funding we need to do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons that those of us on this council are starting to get more involved in the League of California Cities is to bring more diversity of voices to that organization.
I just wanted to add a little bit more about the insurance issue. I forgot to mention this. I've been fighting this insurance company for many years. They've constantly gone and dropped me, and then I fight with them. I get back on the benefits. But this last time, they asked for a marriage certificate. When we submitted that wasn't enough for them. Then they proceeded to say, well, we want your income tax as proof that you're actually legally married or whatever, if I'm a dependent. To Bob's point, that, in regards the medications from the DAP, is it the DAP? Yeah. When it comes to the funding, I totally understand that we're being defunded, but I'm a former client of the DAP. And the thing that they made me go through when I needed assistance to continue my medications, they wanted me to go to apply for Medi-Cal. Medi-Cal, in turn, they told me that I was denied because of my income, but I was approved because of my medical condition. When that happened to me, I appealed that decision, and I had to go all the way to the Riverside, in the city of Riverside, which is an hour away. So I hope that you are listening to my message, because what's coming down is what I was fearful of the minute that the new administration took over. And if we don't pay attention to this issue, there's going to be consequences to our community. So please, I would love for you to really visit this issue legislatively to protect us here in California, not just for us with conditions like HIV or AIDS, but there are plenty of other people that are having to deal with, like with cancer, any other type of medical conditions. So that's all I had to add to that. Thank you.
I just wanted to go back to the housing. I was able to sit in a open study session yesterday in my hometown, and I listened to my mayor verbally say in a public setting, let me ask an ignorant question. So to be compliant with our housing policy, we only have to plan for 20% of housing, but we do not have to build it. And the staff said yes. That is the problem with affordable housing. City councils, you all were being represented at that meeting as doing nothing. They said you publicly are doing nothing for affordable housing. I know this city council, you're way more progressive than any other city council in this Coachella Valley, and I find that completely to be probably false. So that is the issue when it comes to affordable housing. It's not putting a policy in and then deciding once we plan for it, we do not have to build it. It must be built.
Thank you very much. Is there any other final comments?
Just to point out that there are 3 propositions on the ballot that deal with affordable housing.
Thank you very much. Well, again, this is an opportunity for dialogue, and I hope that we can continue to learn and hear about the things that you're working on. Please do seek out the legislative offices just as a situational issue. I had a constituent whose father's home burnt down in the fires in Sonoma and had an issue with insurance, a lap of payments in insurance. Because they worked through our office, they were able to get covered under their loss. But I only share something like that because we do provide essential constituent services. So please do seek out your legislative office to best do a casework, open up a casework for you to give you the information of that situation to see what they might be able to do to assist you where possible. So in any case, and again, my deep appreciation for the council members and the city manager and all the city staff who have been here.
And I think we should give Assemblymember Lowe thank you.
Yes.